In this lecture, I'm going to discuss leadership as interpersonal influence. We're going to discuss where leaders get power, those sources that power that enable them to influence others both within and outside the organization, and the potential outcomes for the uses of each or multiple sources of power. There are certain sources of interpersonal power. The first and most obvious is legitimate power. By virtue of holding a formal leadership position in an organization, we're able to influence people. By being a sergeant, lieutenant, captain, supervisor, manager, or whatever the title is, when an organization confers formal leadership authority in a person, then that person possesses legitimate power and to a certain extent can influence people based simply upon that legitimate power. All of us will, to a certain extent, comply with the desires, orders, or wishes of a person just based simply upon their legitimate authority within the organization. There is, of course, reward power. And reward power is much more readily available in the private sector than the public sector. In the private sector, a leader can leverage reward power by providing bonuses or rewards for certain types of behavior, typically exceptionally good performance in a given endeavor. But in the public sector, those sources are not as readily available. But public sector leaders still have some reward power in the ability to provide assignments that are desirable, the ability to provide training that's desirable, or the ability to put in a good word for a subordinate when seeking promotion. So while less readily available, public sector leaders do still have some reward power. Coercive power enables us to influence people. Again, that is much more easily accessed in the private sector than in the public sector. In the public sector, we adhere typically to what we call merit principles in government employment, where we hire people based upon knowledge, skill, and ability, not political connections. And likewise, we only discipline based upon violations of policy, rules, regulations, or poor performance, rather than not being politically aligned with perhaps a new public official. So coercive power is typically less readily available in the public sector because of the safeguards put in place to establish merit principles in public employment. Expertise provides all of us the ability to influence others. We're typically willing to accept the guidance of those people that we believe to be experts in a given area or arena. All of us accept expertise when we go to the doctor. The doctor is not our boss. We're paying the doctor. It's a physician-client or physician-patient relationship. And while we're not exactly a customer, we recognize that the doctor is committed to acting in our best interest and has a great deal of education and training, and so that doctor is typically able to influence us to a certain extent. The easier it usually is for us to carry out that guidance, the more likely it is. We'll go to the pharmacy and fill a prescription and take pills if the doctor tells us to. Whereas more difficult endeavors such as quitting smoking, exercising, eating right, things of that nature, we may not be as readily willing to accept expert guidance from a physician in that regard. But within the organization, typically, expertise allows an engineer to influence a manager about a technical decision. In policing, a field sergeant, typically readily accepts the guidance of a fatal accident reconstructionist because that person typically has more experience and expertise. So expertise does allow us to influence typically fairly easily. And finally, there's a referent power. All of us are typically willing to accept the influence of those people we respect. And if we respect those people, we generally are willing to go further, especially if that respect is also associated with expertise and in particular legitimate power. Not so much reward or coercive power, but when you combine legitimate, expert, and referent power, that's typically a very strong, solid base from which any of us can influence others. We can view some of these sources of power as being a form of structural power. Resources that are provided to leaders generally give them the ability to reward. We also can make decisions. Sometimes decision making is based upon expertise, but more frequently it's based upon legitimate authority or position in the organization. And finally, there's information. So all of these things are typically sources of power provided by the organization. It gives us resources, gives us the authority to make decisions, provides us information with which we can make those decisions. So that's just another way to think about or to view some of the other sources of power: legitimate power, reward, coercive power, referent, and expertise. There are outcomes to influence attempts. One is resistance. Some people will resist. And of course, you could probably say that there's one cynical form of resistance, and we might call it malicious compliance. Sometimes, if a leader tells a subordinate to do something dumb, if that subordinate doesn't particularly respect that leader or care for the leader, they're more than likely to do it. But that too is a form of resistance. There is compliance, in which we just simply do what we're told. And again, that there can be a blend between compliance and resistance. But compliance is just doing strictly what we're told to do. If they tell you to do A and B, you'll do A and B. If C would be a good idea to add to that, you may not be motivated to move forward to do an additional act. There's identification. When we, again, this is highly related to referent power, but when we identify with a leader, then that identification allows us to more readily be influenced by that person. And then finally, there's internalization, where we internalize the goals of the organization, the goals of the leader, and believe that those things are the goals that we should pursue. Now, in this chart, we will look at, we won't discuss every one of these cells, but we'll look at the pattern that we see here. And typically what we're looking at is those areas where a given outcome is likely. On the far left-hand column, you see the sources of power: referent, expert, legitimate, reward, coercive. And on the top row, you see internalization, identification, compliance, and resistance. The pattern we see there is that from top to bottom and from left to right, we go from the most desired to the least desired. We would prefer that, and the most effective form of influence is based upon referent or respect, and we want internalization. Of course, all the way at the far end, we see the least desirable resistance is the least desirable outcome of leader influence attempts. And at the bottom of that left column, we see coercive as the least desirable base of power from which a leader would attempt to influence others. We see that if we use referent power or expertise power, we're much more likely to obtain internalization or identification with the leader or that expert and the organization's goals, and individuals are more likely to internalize or with those goals and identify with them and pursue those goals. We see that legitimate power is most likely to obtain compliance. And again, that's a relatively low form of behavior in the organization. You don't do any less, but you don't typically do any more than is asked of you. And then finally, we see that reward and coercive powers typically aren't as effective as we might think. that we're very likely to only get compliance with the reward power. Because again, if I, in the private sector, if I tell you that I'm going to pay you 50 cents more an hour if you stamp out 10 more widgets an hour, well, at 10 more widgets, you're going to stop working, even if you could stamp out another 15 widgets an hour, because you're waiting for an additional nickel to get those, or 10 cents, or whatever the case may be, to get those additional widgets stamped out. And coercive power is at best going to achieve compliance and is more likely to achieve resistance. Typically, people are resentful when punished, even when it is deserved. It's just part of human nature that even when we're wrong, and even when we recognize or admit we're wrong, we're still somewhat resentful when we're punished. Again, that's just part of the way we're human and are frail as such. But again, look at the overall pattern here and see where we're most likely to get the outcomes that we seek. And again, the clear message is that all leaders should attempt to the extent possible influence people based upon referent or expert power.